Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the next panel as part of the International Interdisciplinary Conference entitled Memory, Trauma, and Human Rights at the Crossroads of Art and Science. I am Professor Amy Cosimini, a visiting assistant professor at St. Olaf College, and I'll be moderating today's panel. Today, we're fortunate enough to bring together interdisciplinary scholars who will speak on the role of trauma and memory in a variety of written and audiovisual narratives. Each scholar will present for approximately 30 minutes, and then following all three presentations, we'll have a brief amount of time for some questions. So the first presenter is Professor Ana Forcinito, the chair of the Department of Hispanic and Lusophone Literatures and Languages here at the University of Minnesota, as well as the university's College of Liberal Arts Arsham and Charlotte Ohanessian chairs. Her work centers on the investigation of testimonial and audiovisual practices in the Southern Cone and their relationship to the promotion of human rights, the reconstruction of memory in post-authoritarian regimes, and the eradication of gender violence. She has published numerous books and articles on this subject, including the text Óyeme con los ojos, cine, mujeres, visiones y voces, which was awarded the Casa de las Américas Award in 2018. Additionally, Forcinito is the co-organizer, as you all know, of today's conference and the associated working group on memory, trauma, and human rights at the University of Minnesota. Today, she will be presenting her work entitled Plasticity in Written and Audiovisual Narratives, Giving an Account of a Traumatic Past.
So first, I want to give some context about the moment in which approaches to trauma enter the debate on testimonial literature related to human rights violations in the field of Latin American cultural studies. There are two debates I want to mention, and most of you will probably know about them. One took place in the United States. The second one took place in Argentina. In both scenarios, the narration of survivors was questioned. In the first case, the scholar David Stoll argued that there were inaccuracies in the testimonial narrative of the Masha Quiché activist Rigoberta Menchú. The other debate came from the Argentine intellectual Beatriz Sarlo, who put into question the place that testimonial narratives should have, not when they denounce human rights violations, but when they attempt to participate in the reconstruction of the past, in terms of memory, but also politics. In both cases, a heated debate followed, and it is in this debate that trauma studies enter the discussion. And I don't mean to say that it's the only moment, no, but this is the moment that I take as a point of departure. So since the years were 1999 and 2005, and since both controversies use the concept of truth, the contributions of Kathy Caruth, Shoshana Feldman, Dori Love, in addition to Judith Herman, were used to provide a different understanding of the relationship between truth and narratives of traumatic experiences. One of the contributions of trauma theory to this debate was precisely to point to the fragmentary nature of traumatic memories. Trauma theory also served to underline the opacity of the narratives. So it was vital in terms of bringing the listener back to the discussion, and in particular, the expectations of the listener of a testimonial narrative. What type of narrative can we expect in order to understand what happened to other human beings in a traumatic situation? The scenarios of the post-dictatorships are characterized by different manifestations of testimonial literature connected to the urgency of denouncing human rights violations and demands for justice. So the idea of truth is central, and here I am referring both to human rights struggles in the judicial scenario and in the social and cultural one. The problem for those working in human rights was that these theories put into question the idea of truth, meaning here specifically the correlation between a statement and an event or fact, essential to trials, commissions of truth and justice. And perhaps this is not so visible in cases like Argentina and Guatemala. In these cases, state terrorism and genocide involved systematic human rights violations, and many witnesses and survivors could reconstruct the same event in a trial or truth commission. These narratives serve as evidence because many testimonies could be used as evidence in the same event. But if we think about cases of sexual violence, the urgency of having a different understanding of the relationship between trauma and truth is more urgent. Many times, in cases of asylum seeking and cases of sexual violence, women who do not have a coherent narrative or a narrative with no gaps are accused of lying. Trauma theory can be used to complicate versions of truth that do not allow room for gaps, silences, fragmentary memories, and narratives. Within these conversations, one of the more tangible contributions of the neurosciences to these issues is that through the use of new technologies, it is possible now to provide images that can serve, if not as evidence, at least as a reference that indicates that an image is compatible with post-traumatic stress disorder. But also we need to consider some aspect of the debates the neurosciences bring to the legal realm. One of them is the questioning of the notion of responsibility in criminal justice, how criminal responsibility is conceptualized and assessed. This discussion, that might take other routes outside the context of human rights, in the context of human rights and genocide, is highly problematic because it does not relate to any accountability model. I am saying this because we need to be aware of the entrance of the neurosciences in many debates in different disciplines, shaking some important assumptions. Now that I provided the context, I am going to go to my presentation. Briefly about Uruguay. Uruguay has a dictatorship from 1973 to 1985 with many political prisoners. At one point, it was the country in Latin America with more political prisoners per capita. During the dictatorship, Uruguay was known as the torture chamber of Latin America. In this presentation, I will work with two texts. The first one, a novel by Mauricio Rosenkopf, a Uruguayan writer who was also a political prisoner. The second case, a film directed by Álvaro Vuela, a filmmaker who was a child and teenager during the dictatorship. In both cases and both generations, the image of zombie-like existence in one or ghostly existence in the other, and of limbo, is present. They both have a composition, a combination of fragmentary memories and well-organized and linear narrative moments. In the first case, I will refer to the narrative of trauma and the creative reconstruction of the narrative of self, and also point to the plasticity of narratives. In the second case, and thinking about conceptual connectivity also as plasticity of the visual narrative to open new meanings, I will discuss post-traumatic subjectivities not only in terms of those who suffer grave human rights violations, but also for the rest of society living in fear or indifference. A reference to the concept of plasticity, the meaning of plasticity can be related to the molding or sculpting into a shape, also in photography to the different resolutions that can be created through the focus of a photograph, and this is a meaning associated to the arts. It can also mean connectivity and regeneration, a meaning that comes from the neurosciences, plasticity as neuroplasticity, as the possibility to create new neural connections, and also the meaning of plasticity as destruction, as in plastic explosives. And I mention this because this meaning of plasticity serves sometimes to rethink what happened to subjectivity in a traumatic event. I will refer here to Catherine Malabou, a French philosopher who uses plasticity as a paradigm for approaching, among other subjects, the post-traumatic subject. In this presentation, references to Malabou will be related to the impact of trauma on the writing of the story of self. What I mean here is the destruction of the autobiographical narrative, or at least the way it used to be, and the possibility of regeneration of the narrative, both in the autobiography or in the narrative about others. Although here I also want to make a cautionary note about the use of plasticity as the happy solution to everything, since we can rewrite our story and rewire our brain. So what I claim here is, when I talk about plasticity, is that literature and audiovisual narratives allow us to imagine or to see and listen to, and perhaps to witness, the rewriting of the story, and therefore the subjectivity. But they do not erase the wound, the painful experience they are trying to represent, or the severity of the injury and the human rights violations. On the contrary, these are attempts to register them in writing or film and in social memory. And also that there is a desire in the act of making ourselves vulnerable when we narrate a story, the desire of a listener who would listen, and when in relation to human rights, who would become part of a new configuration of memory, struggles related to human rights. The first stop, room 8. Mauricio Rosenkopf, a writer, but also a leader of the guerrilla movement Tupamaros, along with Pepe Mujica, former president of Uruguay from 2010 to 2015, was not only a political prisoner, but also in solitary confinement for most of his time as a prisoner. Like all others, he was heavily tortured. After his liberation in 1985, Rosenkopf himself, with another of the prisoners, wrote Memories of Prison, Memorias del Calabozo, a very well-known testimonial text. Many years later, in 2011, he publishes the novel Room 8, Sala 8. The title refers to a room where prisoners were taken for medical treatment after being tortured and then returned to their prisons or cells. Rosenkopf was here twice, in 1972 and 1974. The narrator presents two simultaneous perceptions in the novel. One, disconnected and lacking consciousness, and the other one with moment of awareness and sharp consciousness. Rosenkopf presents an interpretation of both the detachment from reality and the affirmation of glimpses of awareness and understanding. In the novel, he explains in an interview, I communicate what we were thinking and feeling through testimonial literature, or if you prefer, fantastical literature, putting these two together, testimonial and fantastical. Rosenkopf describes the physical condition of the prisoners in room 8 like this: without passing out, rather groggy, I used to suffer episodes of disorientation in which my thoughts would grow foggy, and when I regained consciousness, I would have no idea how much time had passed. Or here, I was here, but I am not here anymore. The plasticity, malleability of the narrative offers the possibility of transformation and regeneration of the story. On the one hand, the sheets in the hospital beds become clouds in the narrative. Coming from solitary confinement, having sheets in the hospital bed feel like paradise. So when we have a series of changes, metamorphoses, of the images that surround him. On the other hand, his description suggests a space inhabited by ghosts, through a reading that Rosenkopf himself associates with Juan Rulfo's novel Pedro Páramo, a village full of ghosts where even the main character dies, he continues to be the narrator. Nonetheless, at one point, the narrator starts talking to the reader with a cautionary note. Seen from the outside, that is me, seen from the outside, seen by you, with your eyes more or less resting on me, might feel or think, quite rightly, that I am raving mad. It goes on. feeling that I am in this monastery of madness, full of clouds, archangels, celestial silences, is an unmistakable symptom that my neurons have gone off the deep end. Well, fine, so they have, but I still got my wits about me. Though at some point we associate his narrative with a subject who has lost the ability to understand the world around him, the quote, "but I still got my wits about," in Spanish, "pero no masco vidrio," clearly offer us a note of warning. The testimonial and the fantastic take place simultaneously. What he narrates is both testimonial and fantastic, and yet, yes, this is a poetic creation, yes, this is a novel, but let's also remember for a moment what Gabriel García Márquez says about his literature when he receives the Nobel Prize, thinking about magical realism. We had to ask but little of imagination, for our crucial problem has been the lack of conventional means to render our lives believable. What was unbelievable was the experience, overwhelming and unbelievable, and so is the testimony. Yet there is another layer linked to a more conventional sense of testimonial narrative. At one point, a pregnant woman who is taken to a room and who later returns without the baby after giving birth whispers to him, her name is Mariana, in reference to her daughter born in captivity. We don't get many facts in the novel, but this is one of them. But even here, despite the confusion, there is a sense, awareness, a clarity that interrupts the ghostly-like experience he's narrating. This is a moment of clarity, no opacity here. A birth, but also a possible crime, a kidnapping of a baby, the murder of a mother, important information, facts that need to be remembered. I want to return to the problem of truth and to the giving an account of a traumatic experience, and in particular to the expectation of a coherent narrative. Rosenkoff's text can be used to answer this expectation. The expectation of consistency and a linear narrative relates to the way of putting a plot together. Narration is a creative act, and Rosenkoff created that type of consistent, coherent narrative many years before in his testimony, Memories of Prison, Memorias del Calabozo. Now, in this novel, he's pointing precisely to the other form of narrative and this other form of truth. He's giving form to a narrative that is not only focused on the truth of facts, but also on the truth of the sensations, affect, perceptions, and the cloudy memories interrupted by very clear factual recollections. Stop 2, Limbo. I will go now to the second example, a short film by Limbo, directed by Álvaro Vuela in 2013, and based on a text by the Uruguayan writer Roberto Aprato. The film has two parts. The first part is composed with a voiceover, reading Aprato's text, and images of an educational facility, and images of bookshelves and shadows walking that are combined with zombie movies. White Zombie, 1932, Wing of Zombies, 1941. In the second part, without any zombie interferences, we see the writer, Aprato, reading his text to a group of students. The first part. The images are connected precisely through their plasticity. The focus, the composition, dissolving, fading images to connect to others, and this plasticity creates an illusion of continuity, an illusion that attempts to mirror, if we listen to the voiceover, the same illusion during the dictatorship, for those who were not in prison, but watching TV, disconnected, or perhaps attempting to disconnect from what was happening, although the narratives of the movie were related to ghosts, zombies, terror, and therefore were reconnecting them to what was happening at the time. The idea is that for some, the way to connect to what was really happening was through these particular moving images that might not be related to the dictatorship, but that were connected to terror, the blurred line between life and death, and so on. a fusion of spaces and time, not to represent those who were in prison, but those who were outside, actually inside the houses, watching movies paralyzed. The quote, "It was like Uruguay woke up and became something else." And then this is the attempt to explain the enigma of that reality, which does not coincide with any other reality, neither before or after. Limbo is that place that symbolizes social trauma. Not only the trauma experienced by those who were imprisoned, but also for the rest of society. In reference to the approach to trauma articulated by Malabou, Slavoj Žižek refers to the destruction of the subject and the birth of the post-traumatic subject as the zombie-like subjectivity. This concept in Vuela's film is associated not so much with the experience of the political imprisonment or illegal detention. Now here the zombie will be represented as the agent of a memory attack, but with the experience of the zombie-like existence, lack of emotional engagement, profound indifference and detachment of those hooked up to the TV set, watching zombie movies, becoming zombies. That was the way to participate in what existed at that time. Sitting in front of the TV set becomes a sort of limbo that functions as a metaphor for that period. The voiceover explains this more. This was our way of allowing reality to exist in order to think about what would be possible and about all that has been lost. Limbo is, after all, the voiceover says, the irreparable damage embodied in the image of an adolescent sitting in front of the television, and images of zombies and shadows that flicker past again and again. So we have 4 different versions of the zombie. The images of the film showing Limbo, version 1. The reference here is precisely what could not be seen, what happened in prison and clandestine detention centers. Version 2, a version that is absent and present at the time. It also shows those who were not in prison but terrorized by authoritarianism and confined to watch TV, version 3. And finally, it adds another version, those, former militants, then prisoners, now survivors, who now go out to scare people by telling them what happened to them, version 4. Then, in a very different moment of the film, we have a sequence that focuses on the present and with no more interferences of zombie images. And now we see Prato himself, the writer, in an educational building, reading to a group of students his sound text. Again, a new generation, but also younger than Vuela, the director. So now we have 3 generations. And he says, "It isn't a matter of interrogating the past, but of seeing what of the past is alive in the present." But now, going back to Vuela's images, the question becomes, where are the zombies? It is clear that the zombies related to imprisonment have become the zombies survivors that attack oblivion with their stories. But what happened to those watching TV? In what limbo they inhabit today? In this proliferation of limbos proposed by the short film, it is impossible not to think that what Vuela describes with his images is the foundational moment of neoliberal subjectivity. Neoliberalism in the Southern Cone costed many, many lives during the dictatorships and after. These are the indifferent, disengaged subjects with a zombie-like existence, paralyzed by the trauma of terror. Testimonial narratives and artistic practices might play here a crucial role as a way to combat indifference and oblivion in the possible transformation of neoliberal subjectivities. Now is the moment of interpretation in the film, of clarity. And Prato reads, "From the point in the present in which the past, before disintegrating, grants us an epiphany, a meaning, a continuity." Both the idea of limbo and of clarity, illumination in this case, coexist here too. At the end, Apparato requests a moment of silence, and the camera goes through the faces of each of the students, the new generation, listening to the testimonial narrative. The emphasis is here on narrative, but also the transmission to a listener as a possible way to regenerate the social fabric through communities or groups that would keep struggling for justice. There is a project and a desire that these literary and audiovisual narratives are not only accounts of a traumatic past, but that they would create new assemblies. There is also the desire that the stories that are told in literature or film or many other artistic forms would have an impact on the listeners and be a point of departure for new configurations. And here is where the dialogue with the neurosciences might become important to explore not only the brains of those affected directly, but also the effects that narratives of trauma might have in those who are listening. And I do not mean here only in terms of measuring how the listener is affected by a narrative of trauma, but also how different narratives, more chaotic or more organized, can create more or less connections with the listener or the spectator. Now, my last point about plasticity in narratives. When thinking about narratives, assemblies start with the listener and the viewer. In both cases, and analyzed, there is a reference to the listener. There is an direct interpellation. So on the one hand, subjectivity is restored through the plasticity of a narrative. This transformation does not take place only within the narrative, but also through the possible connections established with the listener. Subjectivity is relational. The plasticity of narratives is about the artistic forms or metaphors and fading images, but it is also about the creation of communities of memory. And I return here to the truth and opacity. There is an opacity in the narrative of self, and here I'm following the well-known text by Judith Butler. The listeners also know that they are opaque to themselves. This opaqueness, confusion, not knowing, the partial opacity to oneself, as Butler puts it, is also related to vulnerability, both the vulnerability of the subject and the vulnerability of the narration. Accepting the vulnerability of the narration of others and of self should be also an essential part of the discussion. That is what these two texts are emphasizing, I think, by pointing in different ways that the state of confusion, ghostly-like existence, the opacity of narratives coexist simultaneously with clear and linear narratives pointing to those unforgettable facts that cannot be forgotten. What these texts are proposing, I say, or I claim, is that even when survivors talk about their traumatic past, and even when the narratives are opaque, and even when they talk about the dictatorship with zombie movies, they expose their vulnerability and the vulnerability of the narration. But they still got their wits about themselves. Y no más can vidrio. Gracias.